Okay guys, so in the last class we had a little bit of a look at the different stages of the river. We had the youthful stage, also known as the upper course, where we had these lovely V-shaped valleys and interlocking spurs and lots of waterfalls. We have the mature stage, also known as the middle course, with these wide sweeping meanders, these turns in the river. And oxbow lakes will be the other thing that we'll be looking at here. And then finally, we have the old age stage, also known as the lower course of the river. And in this stage, we still have these big wide meanders, but they're on floodplains now. We have levees, these little embankments next to the river, and we have deltas. So today we are moving on and we're going to have a look at what processes are active in the youthful stage, the mature stage, and the old age stage to form these different landforms. So why is it that we have V-shaped valleys in the youthful stage and not in the old age stage? Why is it that we have meanders and oxbow lakes happening in the mature stage and not in the youthful stage? Well, it's all down to the processes. We're going to have a look at those now. So there are three processes that you need to be aware of. The first is erosion, the second is transportation, and the third process is deposition. So we're going to be going through each of those today. Erosion. So erosion is the breaking down and carrying away of rock. So we already looked at weathering, which was the breaking down of rock, and erosion is different because it also involves the carrying away or the transportation of the rock. So rivers erode in four ways. That's very important to know, and we're going to have a look at each of those four ways now. So the first way is hydraulic action. Hydraulic action is the physical force of moving water, and when it is moving quickly with great force, it can break rocks. It can break parts of the river banks and the riverbed. The way I like to think of this is if you have somebody who is power hosing, and if you were to put a power hose fixed on one spot, you will see very quickly that it will start to wear away even concrete. So it might take a little bit longer for a river, but just think of a river after a flood or during a flood, the amount of water that's moving down through it really quickly in the youthful stage, and the kind of force that that water has. So that's your hydraulic action. The second one is abrasion. Abrasion is how small stones carried by the river wear away the river's banks and the riverbed. So think of these little stones that are being tossed around by a flood in the river, by the force of the moving water. They hit against the riverbed, and when they hit against the riverbed, they break it a little bit or they wear it away a little bit. That's your abrasion. The next one is attrition. Attrition describes how those small stones wear away and break down each other. It's why small stones in a river are rounded further down river you go. So they are rounded because they are breaking away each other as they hit against each other in the river channel. And then the last one, solution. So some rocks, as you know from studying the burn, such as limestone, can be dissolved by weak acids in the water, and weak acids in a river would dissolve soft rocks like limestone, and they would carry away that dissolved rock as part of the water. Now the next thing that we're going to have a little bit of a look at is we're going to have a look at this video on the processes of erosion. So we have the hydraulic action, the force of the moving water. It's eroding the riverbed and the riverbank. Abrasion, when rocks and pebbles hit against the bed and the bank and break it down. Attrition, when those rocks hit against each other and they're worn down and smoothed and rounded. And then the final one, solution, that the rock is dissolved by the water. Okay, so our next thing that we're going to look at, because that's erosion, very important, you're going to be using that right up until your leaving cert. Transportation, also important. So transportation describes how the river moves eroded material downstream. So just think about how the river is breaking down material, and that material, because it's erosion and not weathering, it needs to be moved. That's done by transportation, and it's done by, again, the force of the water moving these things downstream. The material transported by the river is called its load, and that describes everything from sediment, so tiny particles, and solution, up to rocks, which could be small, could fit in your hand, or could be large boulders. So there are 4 methods of transportation that you need to know about. The first one is called traction. So traction is how very large stones and boulders are pushed and rolled along the bed of a river. This usually would happen when there's a flood. So you need a lot of hydraulic action, so the erosion, because of the force of moving water, to be happening, and then you also would get traction. You get these large stones being moved along, rolled and pushed by the force of the water. Saltation. So saltation describes how small pebbles are picked up by the force of moving water, and then they are dropped back down onto the riverbed only to be picked up again. So they are bounced or they are skipped along the riverbed downstream. Suspension, light material, so sand, silt, float in the river, and you'll know that there's a large load of suspension or suspended load in the river if the river has a very dark brown colour. So that tells you it's carrying a large suspended load. And solution, materials that are dissolved in the river, such as limestone. So we're going to watch another little video about transportation processes. So traction, how the rocks are rolled and pushed along the riverbed by the force of the water. Saltation, how they are bounced or skipped pebbles along the riverbed. Suspension, very light particles. And solution, you can't see it, but it's there. Okay, so well done. And then deposition. So if you are depositing something, you are leaving it somewhere. Where you might deposit something, well, you might deposit money in a bank. So deposition is how a river shapes the landscape by leaving or depositing sediment in new places. This makes new land and it adds to existing land, and deposited material can include stones, pebbles and fine particles. So all of this eroded material, all of these load of the river that has been transported downstream eventually has to be dropped by the river somewhere, and that is your deposition. So it happens in several places. So the first one, or the first reason that deposition would happen, is when the speed of the river reduces. So this happens when a river enters a reservoir. So if there is a dam, the lake behind a dam is called a reservoir, and that would reduce the speed of the river and would cause it to drop its load. The second place is a lake, and then when it enters the sea as well, it would reduce its speed and drop what it's carrying. This also happens during a drought. If the river doesn't have a lot of water in it, it can't transport a lot because it doesn't have a lot of energy. The second thing is if the size of the load increases. So this happens after a flood. It also happens when a tributary joins a river. The river loses energy because the size of the load has increased, and it has to deposit again or drop some of the load, some of the sediment and rocks that it has been carrying along. The third one is that the volume of water in the river is reduced. So again, during droughts, you're not going to have rivers transporting very much particles or sediment or pebbles along, because there isn't a lot of water in it, so there isn't a lot of energy. And the fourth one is as the slope or gradient levels off, it causes the deposition to happen. This is because the river loses its speed and loses its energy as it moves through the middle into the lower course of the river. And that is it. So well done, guys.